There are problems in life. There are wars, strife, there are relationship problems. People get married, people get divorced, people get along, and then people don't get along. People have children who rebel, children have parents who do horrible things. Life has a certain level of evil or badness connected to it. Life is also amazing and good and beautiful, and people have really fantastic relationships, and children have good experiences with parents, and parents have good experiences with children, and countries get along, and people decide to be allies and be helpful to one another on grand international scales and on very small scales, just like neighbors. A lot of things go on in life as it pertains to people doing things that are way over here on the scale of bad things that can be done, all the way over here to the scale of just immensely good and wonderful things that can be done. So I'm using words like bad and good and evil and good. And sometimes people have a difficulty with even using the terms good and bad or right and wrong. Like that's going to be something that is going to be oppressive one group of people to another. If one group of people says this particular thing is right, that they're going to oppress another group of people to have to do those particular things. So we have what I'm describing is we have this dynamic that goes on in life called doing. And it's identifiable amongst most humans as you go along that some doings are not helpful, are not something that would be uplifting or inspirational or calming or peaceful, but bring tragedy and pain. And then other things that that doings that happen are inspirational and good and bring peace and joy and benefit. So there's this doings, I'm going to call it doings that go on. But it's recognizable to most humans that there's these doings that, like I said, are not helpful, doings that are helpful. Well, what is the root of things that are done that are helpful and things that are done that are not helpful? Well, there's a concept in Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching, that says it's called Wu Wei Wu, action, non-action. Action, no action, action. Which basically means action that is not a result of doing, but action born of being. And there's the Chinese characters that actually lay that out. Action born of being. Almost any action that could be easily interpreted as helpful, good, peacemaking is action born of a certain kind of being. And the other kind of action is also action born of a certain type of being. So you have this things that are done and then a way of being. And there's a lot of things that can be done. Millions and millions of particular actions. I can walk across a road. I can hit a ball. I can chew gum. I can criticize someone. I can help someone take their groceries out to their car. All kinds of actions. All actions are born out of way of being. A lot of talk occurs having to do with actions, Like if you go to a parenting class, there's a lot of parenting classes that say, hey, if your child does this, do this. I worked for 32 years in treatment programs for adolescent kiddos, and there were all sorts of techniques, rules, protocols that child does A, then staff are to do B, or staff are to do certain things to get kids to do certain things. Very doing oriented. Way of doing things is ubiquitous. It's what policies and procedures are for. It's an employee handbook or rules to go by. There's all sorts of things in this world that have to do with doing. And then there's some talk about being across history as well. And that is actually the subject of this podcast, is way of being. What is it? And how does it influence the doings that go on in life? So, forever, across multiple civilizations, across time immemorial, there have been these concepts known as good and bad, good and evil, right and wrong. What has happened, like I sort of mentioned earlier, is that people will take the concept of right and wrong and they'll turn it into a rule-oriented thing, and then they'll hit everybody across the head with needing to obey the rules that they believe in. Such and such a thing is not right, and so therefore we're going to make the whole country obey this thing. That's where the church and the state were always combined across most of history. The most of the European countries that believed in the authority of the Catholic Church, for example, made people do certain things. The Spanish Inquisition was part of that, just forcing people to believe certain things and do certain things according to the religion in this case, what was right, considered right. So I'm not talking about, when I'm referring to way of being, I'm not talking about a set of rules or set of protocols that somebody's come up with and they call that right. And if other people don't do those things, they're wrong. I'm talking about what goes on inside of my heart when I have a feeling to do something that would be helpful to somebody, or what goes on in my heart when I have a feeling not to do something that wouldn't be helpful to someone and I do it anyway. That is my own personal barometer, thermometer, feeler of what might be a right thing to do or what might not be a right thing to do. And it's not based on anything other than what's going on inside of me, my way of being. There's a philosopher by the name of Martin Buber. He was a Jewish man. He lived in the time of Gandhi and Einstein. He actually communicated with both of those through letters. He and Gandhi had conversations. He and Einstein had conversations. He was well regarded in terms of his expertise or his ability to describe concepts and his authority regarding the concepts that he described. His most famous work was a book called I and Thou. And in that book, he describes that there's two ways of being. And he called the one way of being I-it. I am I-it towards others, or I-thou. I am I-thou towards others. So if I'm I-it towards somebody, he describes in the book, I see people as not quite people. I see them more as objects, as its. And their reality is not as important to me as my reality is to me. And while seeing them as less than a person, more of an it, their significance to me takes on the shape of how they might be interacting with my world, with my priorities. If I see somebody as an it that is not as important as me, not as human as me, not as not as much of a person in their own right, I'm just prioritizing myself over them, but they're still in my life. So if I have this way of being where I see them as an it and they're in my life, then I get this sense of them as entities that they're either sort of bothering me, they're in my way of what I want to accomplish. So I see them as like an obstacle it, or they're totally cooperating with me, and I love every second of it because they're doing what I want them to do, because they're facilitating what I want, or they're at least not getting in my way. And so that would be they're more like a vehicle to me. And my relationship with them is more of a manipulative one. Like they're doing what I want them to do. So I'll tolerate them, or I'll even get along with them in a manner of speaking. Or like a third main way I can see a person that I don't see as a person, that I see more of as an it or an object, is they're just irrelevant to me. And I don't think about them one way or another. And sometimes it's all mixed up. I might see them in all three of those ways almost at the same time, as quickly as they agree or disagree or whatever with me. So when I am it inside of me, my way of being is it, then I sense people as either vehicles for me or obstacles for me, or irrelevancies, typically. And seeing people as one of those three things, I tend to feel either used, or I figure out how to be the user, or they're not really useful, and so I'm just going to go over here and ignore them. So there is no use of them. And I am somebody who walks in the world with people that I see as objects like this, in a way where all of my doings with them are now an outgrowth of seeing them in one of those three ways. And so I either will get along because I've struck some kind of treaty with them, and if they break it at all, I'm now not getting along, or I'm just not getting along in one way or another. They're annoying to me, frustrating to me, hurtful to me. Now, if I see them as a thou, if I am thou towards people, I see them as thous, then their world is just as real to me as mine is to me. I see them as a person. Other terms that have been used to describe this is I am responsive to them. I have an outward mindset towards them. I am out of my box towards them. And people are just simply, at that point, people. And my doings are an outgrowth of me having a way of being towards others, as if they're just as important to me as I am. So if you start from the basis of that there's these two ways of being, as opposed to there's all these doings that can be done, and let's modify our doings, and let's decide to approach a particular problem with a particular doing, then you'll run into problems constantly, because your way of being might be that one where we see people as objects. And so all of your doings are going to come from this place of either manipulating someone or avoiding being manipulated, or something that is the word we can also use as bad or wrong, because it's not helpful to them. Ultimately, it's not helpful to you either. But so way of being has two parts, and only two parts. My way of being is either I it or I thou. If I am I thou, my doings self-modify. If I see people as people, I will be inclined to do things that are fundamentally different than when I see people as objects. One rather famous story on this subject is there was this guy who saw a parking spot out in front of a grocery store that he was going to go park into, but then this other car beat him to it and parked. And almost, the person was so quick to park in that spot ahead of him, it almost caused a wreck. And he was really frustrated, so much so, he got out of his car, walked over to the driver who wasn't even out of their car yet, and was going to confront him about being reckless and, trying to get this spot that's closer to the store and with regardless of whether or not they were going to cause a wreck. And it was this person's auntie, their sweet little auntie that they loved. And so when they saw them, they were like, "Oh, it's good to see you." So they just immediately weren't annoyed with this driver anymore. So what shifted? They're doing, I'm driving different. I'm going to now suddenly decide to act differently. No, their way of being immediately shifted because they loved this person. They saw their auntie as a person all the time, grew up with this auntie around, whatever. And so upon seeing a person who did this doing of beating them to the parking spot, their behavior now is 100% modified. It's great to see you. So complete battles between cultures and countries have occurred because groups of people see other groups of people as objects in certain ways. The they over there are objects to us. The times when treaties are drawn up and people decide, okay, all right, I'll agree to this. If you agree, I'll agree to this doing. If you agree to that doing, as long as they see each other as objects, as enemies, then all they're doing is just waiting for the moment when the least infraction of said treaty happens, and then the war can explode again. This is the same thing that occurs between people in a relationship, whether it's a marriage or something else. If they're basically have a treaty between themselves that they will behave in certain doings, but they stay in this I-it way towards each other, then in effect, all they're waiting for is a breach of the treaty. And then they now know that they can attack, and they feel justified in attacking because that person broke their treaty. A telltale sign of me being in this way of being where I see people as objects is if I seek to justify whatever my doings are. Because in a human mind, we just can't handle doing something we know is wrong and just kind of continuing along. We tend to want to try to figure out how that somehow can make sense. I somehow can justify it. And after a while, we'll get into these patterns and ruts of justification of our doings because of our way of being, to the point where it's really difficult for us to recognize our ways of being. Now, if I am a parent or an influencer of people and my way of being is a certain thing, I'm going to influence those people to have a similar way of being. If I'm a parent, for example, and I have prejudice tendencies, the likelihood that my kids aren't going to have similar prejudices is pretty low, actually, unless they do a particular thing with their own heart to change this pattern that they've grown up with. So ways of being can be passed down for generations. And this is where you'll get these conflicts that countries have had with each other for generations, for example. So one of the ways that we can recognize our way of being is to see whether or not we seek to justify everything, Why didn't you go to the store and buy those things that I asked you to buy? Well, because you distracted me with this or that or the other thing. That's justification. Hey, why did you go to the store and get those things that I asked? That was very nice. Because you asked me to? We don't have to justify the things that we feel are coming from a good place in us. We just do them. This idea of way of being gets pushed aside and clouded. Like the whole concept of that there's two ways of being gets pushed aside, ignored, clouded, muddied over by an individual or groups of individuals that want to justify their behavior. They want things to be about behavior only. That these actions took place. That we're just doing what we're doing. And it's just a decision that we've made. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. Nothing fundamentally right with it. I don't even think we should use the words right or wrong or should or shouldn't, because that's oppressive to other people. Well, if we are oppressing people with values, then yeah, it's oppressive, because I can be in this I-it way of being and fling virtues at other people to try to prove that they're bad. So there's ways to use the terms good and bad and right and wrong in an in-the-box I-it way. There's also ways to not even worry about what terms need to be assigned to it, but just following a sense that we might have to do something good for somebody else. Or having a sense not to do a particular thing that we know is bad and not doing that thing. Then we don't have to justify ourselves. We don't have to try to figure out how to make ourselves feel good and happy while we are self-conflicted. Now, this idea of doing something, even though we have a sense that it's not a good thing to do, or having a sense to do something that we have a sense is good and not doing it, that comes from us. And one term that's been used to describe this is self-betrayal. Because who we're betraying is, or we might be betraying the other person as well, but we're certainly betraying this own sense that's coming into us. Some of the words that have been used to describe this sense are sense, consciousness, conscience, feeling, and we all have it. If we as humans didn't have it, I doubt our species would have survived for very long, because we're capable of doing a lot of damage. And obviously we're capable of doing a lot of good. So this presentation has been about way of being. And that there are two ways of being. One of my other podcasts is going to be about what happens, or what does it look like when a way of being shifts. So when a way of doing shifts, it's because somebody finally convinces us to do something differently in order to get a different kind of result, and so we really work hard on changing our behavior. What I'm going to be talking about is changing our way of being. So to summarize, there's two ways of being. And doing follows way of being. And if our way of being is such that we see people as people, then our doings are automatically ones of cooperation and acceptance and love and caring, patience and forgiveness. And when our way of being is where we are I, it, and see people as objects, then our doings are automatically modified such that now we are suspicious and jealous and hateful and unforgiving and problem-causing, because we will do things in accordance to that set of emotions. So, way of being, 2 of them. Know it, learn it. I suggest finding that book by Martin Buber, Way of Being. Another book that's very useful to understand this concept of these 2 ways of being is a book called Bonds That Make Us Free by C. Terry Warner. And the first 2 or 3 chapters of that book describe this immensely well. Thank you very much.